Welcome back, everybody, to Gods of Tomorrow. This is episode 16. I'm Josh Raw. You can call me Josh. And here we are again. I'm surprised the motherfuckers made it back again. But I'm excited that you were here. We have some awesome interviews lined up. We're going to be doing another one here today. But I do want to share with you guys that this last week, I really got caught up in trying to figure out how many of the commandments God has broken. And whether or not that's really important or not, I'm not sure. I had somebody tell me that it doesn't matter if he broke his commandments or not because his morality is above the law, yada, 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 and it's not really a covenant where he has to follow them. But I was really hung up on Exodus 24, where he says, "You shall not make yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below." And you know that I will always go off and talk about how Christians have done this with the cross or with even Jesus himself. But beyond that point, Genesis 1, 26, 28, God made man in his image after his likeness. Isn't that an amazing challenge against that very commandment that he gave us? I don't know. I think that connection probably fits. And on top of that, I've had a lot of children, which you guys all know, and they're all made in my image. So I guess I'm just creating shit left and right. But beyond all that, let's go ahead and dive into our guest here. You guys probably know him. You've seen him around. His name is Justin. He is with Bullet Holes in the Bible. Justin, I'm so excited to finally have you here talking one-on-one.
Man, me too, Josh. I'm really super stoked to be here, man. It's been a crazy ride just getting connected with the Deconstruction community on TikTok. And you were one of the first persons I found a couple weeks back. And it's been crazy. I mean, when you reached out to me to ask me to have me on the show, I was like, I have to, of course. So your content's been helpful to me as well. So it's
I have been like just reading through your content and watching through your videos, almost binge watching some of them because a lot of your research and your methodologies are similar to my own. I'm like, man, I can almost just like, this guy's doing the work for me at this point.
Yeah, that's what I hope to do. Literally, I really hope that I can take the meat and potatoes of scholarly, studies and just try and spell it out plainly for people who won't ever read that stuff or can't understand some of the verbiage. I'm sure you could, but there's many out there who can't. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, that is exciting. Now, you're relatively new to TikTok, so I imagine finding the deconstruction community there has been a challenge, but this isn't really your first community hop. You were lodged well within a huge community of Christians when you were running, what was it called? I thought I had Christian Truthers, right?
That's right.
And then you had to essentially leave that community and find another community even on YouTube. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, sure. And it's not just leaving that community. I'm actually like working against that community in a way because so in 2017, I felt called by God, through the Holy Spirit. I was in the middle of a long fast and prayer session, and I really felt like God was calling me to start teaching what I know about Scripture and the extra biblical books and the things I was starting to learn with everyone else on YouTube. So I literally quit my job to focus all of my time and attention to sort of building an online ministry, which I called myself an online missionary when I started out. So my wife, thankfully, she has a really great career and she's very good at it and she loves doing it. So we're in a place where we said, you know what, I can take the hit of just losing my income and focusing instead on this. So for the first 2 years, I really didn't make any money at all doing it. And I think on the third year, I made like 30 grand, which off of t-shirt sales and stuff. But that was never the point anyways. Wasn't ever to make money. It was to create documentaries that would help Christians understand the deeper theologies that they are surrounded by and help them break down sort of the prophetic ideas that are lodged in the Old Testament. And most importantly, I was trying to help people understand how they're supposed to live today. Because that's one of the things that, there's 30,000 Christian denominations because they're all in disagreement about how they're supposed to live today and what to expect in the future as well. So I decided just to heck with that. I'm gonna go to the Greek and go to the Hebrew and try and figure out for myself what faith is and what grace is. And so as I started teaching those things on YouTube, I garnered a following pretty quickly. It took a little bit longer to get 50,000 followers on YouTube than it did on TikTok. And TikTok, it took me 5 weeks, and YouTube, it took me like 3 years. So So yeah, during that time, I ended up, like I said, with 50,000 YouTube followers of my YouTube channel called Christian Truthers, and additionally, I had 350 Patreons, and I had a off YouTube Zoom actually. We were using Zoom Bible study groups that I managed, and so we had 800 people sign up for those, and so I broke all of those people into groups of 10, just like Moses did. And each of the group of 10 had a little leader in there, and we were using the Marco Polo app, which is like a video messaging app, kind of like Snapchat, except you can go back and look at all your history with your conversations. And they were using that to kind of keep each other accountable, pray for each other, and just stay on the up and up on a daily basis. And then on a weekly basis, we would have Bible studies via Zoom for men, women, and children on different days. And then every Friday night, I would go live for about an hour and a half and teach out of the Torah. So, yeah,
sounds like you dabbled just a little bit then. Like, sounds like you have some knowledge around Christianity.
a little bit. Yeah, I mean, and of course, that's all coming from, I'm 38 and I was literally born and raised Christian. There was a period in my 20s where I was less interested in it than I am now. But by the time I was in my early 30s, I really just fell in love with it, and I really felt convicted and called to take it more seriously, because I felt like I was in the Marine Corps for 13 years. I was an infantry machine gunner, amongst other things, and so that community and that lifestyle is not very conducive to Christian morality. And Marines are really great dudes. I really love them so much, but they're definitely not the model citizen in terms of Christian morality.
I really love that part of your story, because one of my dearest friends was a Marine, evangelical, a Jesus freak, if you will, went into the Marines and came out of it and lost his faith after the process of being in there. And he was one of the most devout individuals I'd ever met in my life. And he too, he had a near-death experience while he was there. And went to the other side and found that there was nothing, and came out of that and lost his faith. But that's a story for another time. But one of the things that really strikes me about your story, which I think is similar to many that are now atheists, is that you went so deep into the theology of Christianity and with the purpose of teaching better, to really guide people, to help people. And in the process of doing that, you broke down the religion and ended up having to step away and going, this is layers and layers deep, but it's not real.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah. So really what really started the massive change for me and deconstruction process for me, well, there's not just one thing. There's many things as there's with you, I'm sure, and everybody else. There's always going to be some small, when you think back about your experience with Christians, you're going to remember like, oh yeah, they were pretty narcissistic, and they did hurt me sometimes, and they were, kind of mean and judgmental to me. But those aren't the reasons that ever swayed me. I knew that Christians were, sinful just like everybody else. So that part of it, I've received abuse from Christians and non-Christians. So that alone is not for me a determining factor.
Yeah, people are people.
Exactly. So especially Christians. So what really did it for me was I became Torah observant. So as my faith progressed through understanding, the early Christian faith and digging into the earliest texts I could find and trying to understand the earliest roots of Christianity, I progressively went from being sort of like, I guess you would say, just a very serious mainline Christian who just knew a lot about the New Testament, to being a Messianic Jew where all I ever did was study the Old Testament for a very long time. And I really was wanting to understand the ins and outs of keeping the Torah. And to the best of my ability, my wife and I kept Torah for about 2.5 years. And that means Saturday Sabbaths, which with no work, no electronics, like none of that stuff. Our electronics use came sort of returned after a while. We decided we could use it to watch Bible studies and stuff, But we never ate pork or shellfish or any of the forbidden foods in the Leviticus. we did the biblical feasts. So we never did Christmas because it's pagan. It's, it still is. We never did Easter because it's pagan. We never did Halloween or any of those things because they're all pagan. All we kept was the 7 biblical feasts, which are also kept by the Jewish people. So the easiest way to describe what I became is a Messianic Jew. But honestly, I went to many Messianic Jew gatherings and get-togethers and Sabbaths, and I found out that they are just as mainstream and kind of worldly as the regular Christians are. If they were raised as a Messianic Jew, it's just kind of it's cultural for them too. And so I thought that I'd find a lot more hardcore scholars there, and they were really just as not interested as most Christians are, but they were raised that way. So but yeah,
if you don't mind,
yeah.
I have a question. You told me nothing was off limits, so
Yeah.
I want to throw this one in here a little bit, and hopefully this doesn't step on the toes of your wife. But I'm curious, in your relationship, as you've kind of went from being a New Testament individual to becoming a Messianic Jew to now being in the Deconstructionist camp, has your wife kind of come along with you in that journey? Have those paths come parallel? Has this been a stressor on the relationship? Is it always kind of been this open discussion about spirituality and finding it? Because I know there are a lot of couples out there that sometimes divert ways and trying to figure out what we believe and can we make this work with different beliefs, or how does that look for you? Like, how's that journey been?
Yeah,
if you don't mind.
That's actually a very good question, and one that I'm not actually asked very often. And I have to start by saying that I am just the luckiest man in the world, and I really sincerely mean that. Since the day I married her, Jackie, which was coming up on 10 years married and 11 years together, all of my friends have been in agreement everywhere I go through life that I'm super freaking lucky, because Jackie is literally my best friend, like quite literally my best friend. And this isn't just something that I say. Like, I don't hang out with anybody else, honestly. So Jackie and I have always been the type to. So while she was focusing more on professional life during the day, and I was able to focus more on theology and philosophy and research during the day. And of course, I was also working through 2 master's degrees during that time too. So I was also doing a lot of school and stuff like that, and the house and kids. But we would always come together at the end of the day, and we would decompress and sort of debrief. And what she would do is I was always asking her to, I was always trying to sit there and listen to her for 30 minutes to an hour and just tell me about your work day, what happened with your boss, your coworkers, whatever. I think this is why we're so close, honestly, because I know what's going on even with her job, like as good as her coworkers do. But she's the same, always been the same with me, and so she's, we ended up staying all night up sometimes just talking about the stuff that I'm looking at. She wants to watch the same stuff I watch. She wants to read the same books I read and check it out. And we have just literally stayed in sync the entire time. And I know that especially when I was running Christian Truthers ministry, I did marriage counseling and I answered a lot of emails and things like that. And we are definitely a rare in that way. I know that many people, as soon as they go from Christianity to Torah observance, even just that jump, like, hey, we're not going to do Sabbath this way anymore. We're not going to do Christmas anymore. That alone is enough to really start causing a lot of friction in families. So I can't even imagine how much harder it is to go from Christianity to just being agnostic, atheist, or something. I haven't experienced that, but I've seen a lot of pain and divorce even because of it. So I can sit here and honestly tell you that I could probably just get up and let Jackie come in here and she could probably answer the questions for me. I'm not even kidding. Like, she really cares a lot about this stuff, and I'm very, very lucky. Yeah. So
yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I don't want to steal your thunder, in having that relationship with my wife and myself are similar. And I've seen you and Jackie kind of in different realms talking together, and you seem very in sync. And
yeah,
I rarely see that in other couples, and so it's a beautiful thing. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
man, thank you. Yeah, I saw. And by the way, my wife's been watching your wife's TikToks too lately, and she's loving the content over there also. So
Yeah. She does spiritual coaching is primarily what she calls it. So she does it, and you may know this from watching some of my content, but I'm a licensed master social worker. I've been doing that work for a while. I was a therapist for a long time. So
Wow.
even when I stepped away from Christianity, I didn't really kick out the leg of spirituality as being an important factor of being human. I see
Hmm.
that as being something that people explore and need to experience in one way or another, no matter how you define that.
Right.
Some people find it by being in nature. Some people find it through meditation. Some folks find it through, relationships and connection with others. Some people find it in seeking, a connection with a higher entity or a greater
Hmm.
power, or a greater force. I don't really judge that. I'm cool with people doing whatever they want to do in that realm, as long as they're not indoctrinating others and forcing it onto others and saying
Yeah,
you have to be this way.
that's it. That's really it. That's the whole
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, I mean, I'm very open to that too. I mean, initially when I left Christianity and started realizing how how many problems there are with it, like theologically or historically, I was like, look, I don't believe anything anymore. Period. But the more I've sort of chilled out over the last year and a half and started reading again and getting into, especially studying near-death experiences, studying
Mm-hmm.
reincarnation. I'm really excited to make a documentary about reincarnation,
Mm-hmm.
and just also, psychedelic therapies, psilocybin
Mm-hmm.
mushrooms, and
Mm-hmm.
DMT and all that. The more I start studying that, the more I'm like, okay, so I'm not going to just like, I don't know if we should call it spiritual or not, but I'm not totally
Mm-hmm.
done with it. I'm just done with the version of it that judges and attacks people. like, you know,
Yep, I think that is fair. So I do want to dive into that, and we got plenty of time to talk about this. I've always, I know with you, essentially being in the same camp as a Messianic Jew, and of course being in the Christian camp as well. There's probably a lot of knowledge that's in your head around early churches, their
hmm
formulation,
oh
how
yeah.
those ideas kind of got put together, how they spread, and then especially that relationship between the early Jewish people and those that were stepping into those first churches that were created by Paul
hmm hmm
during those time periods. So I do want to explore that a little bit. I've
Absolutely.
always kind of seen the New Testament as a marriage between some Jewish content and Hellenistic Greek content, and
hmm
just marrying these mythologies and putting them together. And that's what Paul was preaching, because he kind of had a foot in both worlds.
hmm
But if you would just kind of
Yeah.
lead us down your own studies and what you've been looking at
Oh,
there.
that is a really wonderful way of overview. Now, my studies first started with studying Paul himself. From a and when this is when I was still believing that the Bible was accurate and inspired and stuff, and actually
Mm-hmm.
studying Paul himself and comparing his teachings to the Torah and comparing his teachings to Jesus. This is when I was Torah observant, of course. I quickly realized that there's a lot of problems with Paul, and Paul, I concluded actually that he's a false apostle, and I made a video series called 50 Reasons to Never Quote Paul Again. And that was actually designed to tell Christians, like, look, this dude's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Um, but it's funny because now looking back on everything, I look at it from a historical viewpoint, not
Mm-hmm.
believing that any of it was, actually true, literally true. And it's really interesting because Paul, what most people, I wish if people could understand Paul and Hellenization of the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
especially, and those two, how like you said, how those two come together. I mean, there'd be no argument, in my opinion. There'd be no argument left, in my opinion. So, it's funny because what the Hellenization of the Jews is, as you already know, is the Greco-Roman sort of influencing of Jewish people, and the Hellenization period goes back, I think, to 400 or 500 BC.
Mm-hmm.
BC, yeah, and from then, so 500 years before Jesus ever shows up on the scene or Paul ever shows up on the scene, there's already these sort of Jewish philosophers starting to mix the works of Plato and the works of Homer, and you see a lot of these Greco-Roman ideas start slipping into their thinking. And
Yeah.
the Jewish elite were very much in contact with and tangled up with the Greco-Roman elite also. So you see a lot of the Greco-Roman influence just growing and growing and growing closer to Jerusalem and in Jerusalem, leading up to the first century, where we have this scene where Paul comes on the scene. And yeah, Paul. I mean, both in the text of the New Testament and otherwise, Paul tells us plainly that he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Jew of Jews, from the tribe of Benjamin, but then he also says that he's a Roman citizen, Roman-born citizen. And of course, after he has his vision on the road to Damascus, the first time he sees his version of Jesus, which is different than everyone else's version of Jesus, by the way. When he sees his version of Jesus, after he does, he actually leaves and goes to Arabia for 2 years to stay. And Arabia was where some of the Roman elite families were living. And actually, Paul mentions the name of, I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but Paul mentions the name of one of these families in his letters in the New Testament as one of his friends. And so you see this connection that Paul was deeply tied into the elite Roman people. He was also deeply tied into the, Pharisee elite Jewish people. And what he came bringing with him, as I showed in one of my videos, is a lot of Plato and a lot of Socrates and a lot of Aristotle. And that's what his gospel really was taking these ideas but it's funny because it'd be tempting for someone who doesn't know this to think, oh, well, Paul was, a very smart guy and he was on his own program and all this stuff. But the reality is that's not true. He was really just the outcome of a much larger group of Hellenized Jews who had very similar thinking already, and they were already sort of amalgamating the Greek ideas into Jewish ideas and trying to make those work and kind of mix them together. And I think there's a quote by Plato who says that the Torah, if the Torah was designed to prepare the Jews to receive Jesus, then philosophy, like Greek philosophy, is the everyone else's version of that prepared them to accept Jesus. And so you see how, like, even in that one statement, there's this merging of two different cultures or coming together to create this new religion called Christianity.
Absolutely. I've had conversations before, and I'd love your take on this. This is kind of speculation, but you might be able to add some weight to maybe even this argument, is that we know that the Jewish people were being persecuted for years, even all the way back to Herod. I mean, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the influence. They were essentially being paraded around like cattle in the Middle East in many ways. So they didn't have the power to push forward their ideas and their conceptualizations and the things that they wanted to do. If the early Jews had the power of Rome, we would all be Jewish. We would, maybe not Jewish, but that religion would be dominating the world much more than Christianity did.
Right.
It's because Paul was able to take these Orphic doctrines that come out of Plato, Hellenistic time period, and mirror that and mix it with Judaism and his connections with those elites that allowed it to catch like fire and spread like it did through time. If that hadn't happened, Christianity would have died off as a cult thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. And that's why you see Paul emphasizing that he is the disciple to the Gentiles. And he literally, every time he goes in according to the New Testament, every time Paul goes into Jerusalem to basically pay homage to the other 12 and actually pay them, bribe them, because he always brought them money, you see that they basically are...
We all need a friend like Paul.
I know, yeah. Hey, let me join you guys, yeah. Anyway, this is assuming, of course, any of this is accurate, but so Jerusalem, you see in the New Testament, Jerusalem is where the 12 stayed, and they continued operating out of there. And by the way, they weren't being haggled with or anything. So none of these stories like Paul has of going to Jerusalem and everyone wants to kill him and kicks him out. Or he goes to Asia and everyone wants to kill him and they kick him out of Asia too. And that only happens with Paul. The other 12, for some reason, were different. And I think I know what the reason is, based at least on the narrative that we can look at, is that the 12 were still Jewish. They were still keeping the law. They were the original, and that goes back to, before I deconverted or deconstructed, I had whittled my way down to becoming what I called an Ebionite. So an Ebionite, the Ebionites were the very, very first Christians, and they were 100% Torah observant Jewish in every single way. And they continued keeping the feasts, and nothing changed for them, except they also had faith that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and all this stuff. And that there was a they believed that this was a necessary new chapter, basically, because the temple had fallen. So now they can't do their sacrifices in the temple, so they're going to stick with this Jesus sacrifice thing. But
and just for those that are listening, this is prior to the modern eschatology of how Christians view things, and that has to do with like the afterlife, judgment, death, the resurrection. This is prior to our ideas of Satan and hell and heaven. The Ebionites would not recognize any of those conceptualizations that we have in Christianity today. That is before all of that developed.
right.
So, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, Jesse.
No, yeah, you're right on. You're right on. Yeah, so Paul essentially was, like I said, his focus was always to go to the Greeks, so-called, into the northern kingdom of Israel, where they had already been largely the northern kingdom of Israel, which was broken into two nations essentially.
Yep.
A Sumerian region was already worldly compared to Jerusalem in their minds. So it was easier for Paul to do his work up there, and of course over in Greece and places like that, it's much easier because they were already familiar with the Stoic, Platonic philosophies that he was sharing with them. But what I think's very, very interesting is that we just assume when we listen to Paul's gospel or anything like that, we just assume this is so new and this is like some great new good news, and that's why it was accepted, because it was so powerful. Like this message must just be so powerful to make this spread so like this the way it did. But that's totally what we're missing. Most Christians are missing, is that the reason it was so easily adopted was because they already believed this stuff. They already believed most of this stuff. They just called it something different. So when Paul's talking about, the Son of God, died, and we're going to do the Eucharist, and we're going to drink his blood and eat his body, and he rose from the dead, and he was born from a virgin mother, and all this stuff. All the Greeks listening would have been like, oh yeah, that sounds like my other. I also have in my room, I have three or four more other deities like that, like Dionysus, and Romulus was another one, and so they're like, yeah. So to them, it wasn't a matter of like,
It's like a crazy tale. It was a well accepted story that was applied to many god men.
Right. Yeah, seriously. I mean, there was so much polytheism too in Greece. So it just sounded like something that they've already seen before and are already messing with, and it just didn't. It was an easy thing to go ahead and say, oh, okay, so Paul's telling us that the elites in Rome and Jerusalem are really into this Jesus thing. So maybe we should switch from Dionysus to Jesus because that's more popular, And it wasn't necessarily like this. We have this story of the early Christian church just being on fire for God and growing so fast because the Holy Spirit had them doing miracles. Yeah. And it's like, no, that's not how it actually happened. It just sort of slowly grew among the elites and then trickled down to everyone else.
So I'm curious, in what you've seen, would it be safe to say that it's almost like them just kind of picking up another patron god or another patron deity to put into the house? It's not like they are losing even connection with Dionysus. It's like, oh, I'll get an altar to Jesus put up as well, and I'll pay him homage for certain things as well, like they would for gods for whatever they're praying for. And it wasn't really until
325,
when Christianity became the Roman religion, that they were like, oh, now we're doing away with all the rest of the gods.
Exactly. Right. Yep. As soon as that happened, I think it was 325, the Council of Nicaea. I think that was like the beginning where they were like, it's the official religion of Rome. And they also talked about the Trinity for some reason in there, which is funny because the Trinity is also another very well accepted Roman pagan Greco idea. Like it wouldn't have been hard for the Romans to be like, oh, okay, so we'll just do the one then. Okay, cool. Like, it's just funny. Like for us looking back, we're like, it must have taken miracles for these things to happen the way they did. And it's like, not really, it's just kings with power decided this is what they were going to go with because they liked, I think they liked the control mechanisms of it, honestly,
I think the frustration is that I found in my own journey is how much we aren't taught about that history in a well-educated way to allow us to kind of make a decision for it. I mean, especially here in Western culture where we see that children are born into families that already have this belief system, this theology that they then indoctrinate their kids into and pull them into that. And it just continues in this pattern.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the name off the top of my head of the individual that said, the best way to determine what the religion will be for an individual is to put them into a family that has that same religion and you can keep it going. And this is why we saw things kind of pushed onto cultures by Christians for hundreds of years to force cultures into Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even in England, you were killed if you denied the Trinity up until like 1860.
Wow.
It was against the law not to believe in the Trinity.
Wow. Wow. That's crazy. I mean, I totally believe that. That's crazy. Yeah. I mean, once it really took hold, it became a form of government. It really was. Like, we look back and we see how, especially in England, the cardinals had such control over government in all these European countries, and then you have King Henry, of course, wants a divorce, and so we end up with the Church of England. But like, you see, like, just even beyond that, just how much control the Catholic Church, or I should just say the Christian Church in general, really had, because they have, it seems like at every high post in government there was a cardinal right there to like give his approval or non-approval. It's crazy power structure. It's amazing that it's weird how at first it had to be like a sort of tangible force where you force this Christian thinking and force this structure of government and this force this with laws and all this. But now it's developed so extensively into the, like you said, generationally, family through family through family, that now it's like it's in our own heads. No one's Rome's not here anymore, beating you if you don't believe in the Trinity or whatever. I mean, not Rome, but England. But we beat up ourselves, like, if we dare question, the Trinity, or if you question the Trinity, you might get kicked out of your church or lose a friend group or something, or people might just think you're working for a demon now or something. So now it's more of a social thing and a psychological thing than it was back then. Back then it was just, like you said, it was very tangible and very like forced. So
yeah. And now we have 30-year-olds all over the country going through existential crises, trying to figure out who they are and what they believe. Because, like I mentioned earlier, we can't just kick out the spiritual leg out from underneath that table of what makes us human. We have physical elements, psychological elements, emotional elements, and spiritual elements. And people don't know what to do when they've spent 3 decades of their life believing something, leaning on something, having a definitive reason for who they are and why they're here and what their purpose is, and then that just gets kicked out from underneath them. They just can't let it go, and it causes them to go into this dark place of just like, who am I? What am I even doing now?
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, that's exactly what, people who are deconstructing, in my opinion, the first thing they should do, in my opinion, is look for that, that inherent morality that exists in everyone, and learn who you are as a human being. For me, it helped to study Tao, and it helped to study some Buddhist concepts, and just really realize that, like, there's so many other alternative, not religions, but alternative ideas and answers about who you are, why you're here, why you're still important, and why you're still relevant. And I think Christians, like, to them, that's the biggest fear, I think, is once they realize, okay, well, if this is all fake, then I feel like I'm being cast into this area of darkness where I don't know what's going to happen out there, and who am I going to trust, and what am I going to do now? You're really on your own, like, in a big way. That takes a lot of bravery to deconstruct.
Yeah. And I'll tell you that the one, which I'm sure you know this from your testimony when we started this conversation, is that the one up that Christians have on non-believers or those of other belief systems, for the most part, is their sense of community. Having that once a week, or in my case, we're going 3 or 4 times a week to a church where you're being with your community and you have that support and that encouragement, is reinforcing. You feel connected, and the moment you deconstruct, you oftentimes feel alone. So you have to replace that with something. And many atheists, agnostics, even those of other practices or belief systems, they have a hard time finding that community and getting centered and having some sense of feeling supported. And that can be super difficult. So as you're questioning those things, you have to find someone to guide you.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, I only had Jackie at first, my wife, and thankfully that's grown over the last year and a half. But we felt very isolated, and we were scrambling to find people who, we were surrounded by people who hated us mostly at that point, because I was always so public about what I believe. And when I did Deconstruct, I took my Christian Truthers channel and I changed it. I changed the name of it to Bullet Holes in the Bible, and I took all my Christian content down and started putting up deconstruction content. So we were not only isolated, but we felt like everyone on the outside was just screaming at us. That's how it felt for us, because we were only connected to these Christian groups. I mean, we were so isolated. Like we were in Torah, for example, Torah observant. My parents, we don't even talk to them because they hated Torah observance. They hated how religious I was before, So we were just literally like flying solo. But one of the first things we did when we kind of got our bearings was put together a Facebook group, and we started inviting people who we were starting to find some people who were, in the same place we were. And still, it's only like at 120 people in that group, but it's just nice, to have somewhere you go and just vent or just put up a silly meme about something you learned and have people like, kind of giving you that reassurance. Because like you said, you lose all that reassurance,
absolutely. We have a Discord group that we do the exact same thing, and there's different channels to talk about deconstruction and Satan and hell and heaven and even metaphysical stuff or pagan practices, other belief systems, and people just share resources. And we only have a couple hundred people in there. Yeah. But it's such a supportive community, and people know they can always come in there without judgment.
Yeah, that's the best part about being outside of Christianity is like we can all really get along. I mean, there's really no reason for us to not, when everyone's at a place of being deconstructed, because the last thing you want is to start forcing your beliefs down someone's throat. Like we all don't want that, so it's really nice and comforting to just see people have so many different perspectives. And like I said, deconstruction TikTok has been a lifesaver too,
Yeah. I feel like I stole you a little bit because we kind of changed gears and went that direction. Anything else that you wanted to add with Dionysus, maybe even Plato's kind of stepping into Orphicism and how that influenced things, and Paul?
Yeah, sure. So I really wish every Christian knew who Dionysus was. So Dionysus is a wine god who is also the god of sacrifice, and the god of what's it called? He's known as the God who comes. Like a God who comes to who reaches out and basically makes contact with human people. And Dionysian cults are traced back to about 1300 BC, so long way back. And I think the oldest relief, like actual tangible picture they have of Dionysus is from 570 BC. And it actually is a picture of him, and it even says Dionysus on it from 570 BC. So we know that he goes way back, and he's very involved. And so there is, of course, a lot of literature about him. There was a really famous play written about him by a guy named Euripides, and Euripides wrote a book called The Bacchae, or a play called The Bacchae, right? And so the Bacchae was actually performed at the theater of Dionysus for the first time in 405 BCE. And so I really have to encourage everyone to read the Bacchae if they haven't before. Now, when you look at Dionysus, it's not like, it's just so frustrating. Like, for example, if you go on Google and put in, is Jesus Dionysus? Well, all you're going to get is, for 1,000 Christian articles telling you all the differences between Jesus and Dionysus. That's all they can do. That's all they can do is say, oh, but look how many differences there are. It's yeah, okay. That's easy. Anyone can compare two things and say, look at all the differences. But misses the point. The point is, Dionysus is a demigod. He's half man, half god, born from, depending on which story, born from Zeus and simile. He was killed, torn to pieces, and eaten by the Titans, and he was resurrected.
After 3 days, right?
I don't remember if it was the 3 days on him specifically, but there are that is a motif. I think Osiris was in the underworld for 3 days, I believe.
Yes, he was.
But yeah, so basically, when you look at just the motifs that they use in telling stories about Dionysus, it gets real creepy and weird fast because, for one, you see that Paul borrowed his road to Damascus conversion experience completely from that play, the Bacchae, So in the Bacchae, you have this character Dionysus is being written about, and he's going around and trying to make converts. And one of the things he does is he gives out wine to people, and he has like a ton of women. He was known to be surrounded by women, like almost like brides to an extent. And basically, people believe that if you, this is kind of a separate side note, people believe that when you did like a Eucharist ritual and ate the body and drank the blood of Dionysus, you would be indwelled with the spirit of Dionysus. And so, very interesting there. But so in this play by Euripides, Dionysus is this demigod who's showing up and he's appearing to people to let them know that he's alive, that he's still alive. As he does this, showing up here and there in different lands, he's growing his group. He's getting a bigger following. And so there's a character named Pentheus. I think it's so wonderful that his name even starts with a P, like Paul's. There's this character Pentheus who's going around and he's persecuting and trying to condemn and shut down this growing Dionysian cult that's happening. And on his way to do that, he's met by this apparition of light. It's Dionysus. He shows himself, and he literally uses the same phrase that Paul uses or that's used about Paul in Acts. And it says in what Dionysus, or what Euripides wrote about Dionysus, was Dionysus says, Pentheus, he's like, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks, since thou art immortal, but I am a god, And you have the almost the identical quote Paul uses when Jesus shows up on the road to Damascus. He's like, Paul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. He says the same thing. It's the same story. It's like, oh my gosh. Why would, if Paul was a real character, and we can, be sure of that, and his as a historical character, is if he's properly, being represented by the book of Acts and all the books that he wrote himself, then why would you need a copy? Why would you need to copy these other stories for that? It really, to me, it's bad. So,
yeah, I just keep thinking, like, how is not just a kick straight in the teeth and recognizing that mirroring itself? Paul wrote 13 out of the 24 books
yes.
of the New Testament. It is primarily the Church of Paul that you are worshiping when you get in there. And you have his one experience with Jesus being copied from a previous play that was written. He didn't know Jesus. He never met Jesus. He never saw Jesus.
Right.
He took one thing out of a play and made a religion out of it.
Yeah, and actually Paul's first writings about Jesus came 20 years after Jesus would have died. So he literally didn't know anyone. Well, I guess you could say that he met the 12 disciples eventually, but he literally supposedly had no contact with them, knew nothing about him. And it's
that's
just
why he never speaks of his miracles. He never quotes
that's right.
him.
That's
he never
right.
puts anything like that within his own stories.
That's exactly right. I can't recommend enough a book by Dr. Richard Carrier. I don't know if you've read it or not. It's called Jesus from Outer Space. And Dr. Richard Carrier is one of the most brilliant-minded scholars on. He studies ancient history, but he's focused all of his attention on the New Testament. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And he's written very good books about it. He tends to be on the stage. You know who Bart Ehrman is?
Oh, yeah.
Him and Bart Ehrman kind of go back and forth on the historicity versus mythicism. So Andrew Carrier, or Dr. Carrier, Richard, not Andrew, he's a mythicist. And he's actually the first mythicist PhD to pass peer review and get his work accepted into as a scholarly work. So we can literally, based on scholarly criteria, take him very seriously. So in his book, Jesus from Outer Space, he shows you very clearly what you just basically said. Paul's version of Jesus was the first version of Jesus. Now, of course, we know Jesus came from Dionysus and all these other motifs, but when they did build Jesus, Paul was the first one to start doing that, right? And calling him Jesus. So, or Jesus, actually. So, when he, I lost my train of thought here. So when Paul does this, his version of Jesus is not earthly in any way, shape, or form. And this is something that's is huge. Again, this is something I wish all Christians knew. The first version of Jesus that Paul wrote about was not a man who walked around the earth and ate food and hung out with his disciples. Paul never mentions a virgin birth or a birth at all. Paul never mentions Nazareth, Bethlehem. Paul never mentions any of the miracles of Christ. Paul never mentions anything about the Passover or the Passover or the crucifixion, like the beatings and all the stuff. He never mentions anything Jesus says. He literally doesn't mention anything about Jesus, like his earthly ministry whatsoever. So if you only take, and Paul, here's a perfect example. Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, he says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual or principalities and spiritual forces in high places," right? So Paul's version of Jesus is a version that only is like an angel of light who comes, shows up, and reveals himself to people and then disappears again. Paul doesn't.
I feel like I'm just piggybacking off of you, but that is just another example of how Paul is Hellenized, because these are not Jewish beliefs.
No,
Jews
right.
do not believe in this spiritual, existential, lifting up to a otherworld heavenly place. That is a place reserved only for the divine. That's where God is. Even in the resurrection, they do not get resurrected to heaven. They don't go there. This is why the Gospels show Jesus as flesh and blood with holes in his hands, eating fish that you can touch and feel, because there's not this spiritual form of him, which Paul does not reflect in his own writings.
Exactly.
It shows his influence from the Greeks.
Right. Yeah. So Paul's understanding of who Jesus is, which he's the first author about this guy. So, right. It's kind of weird that, and you're right on. The church actually teaches Paul. They don't teach Jesus. It's very rare that a church actually does everything according to Jesus. It's very rare. They usually do everything according to Paul. So if we go off of Paul's original version of Jesus, he wasn't a dude who came, was born of a virgin, walked around, grew up, did some crazy miracles. John the Baptist baptized him, and then he went on to walk around, and then Paul doesn't know about any of that. He doesn't know about any of that. So even when Paul, if you look at the New Testament, even when Paul refers to the other 12, he's assuming that they also received revelation the same way he did. He doesn't say anything about them like hanging out with them and stuff, So, and again, this is the earliest writings of Paul were 20 years after Jesus supposedly died. And again, this is a big point too, is Jerusalem was a very literate city compared to most of the earth at that time. I think one of the anthropologists that I watched a video on, I need to source this, but I think she said that she thinks that at least 12% of the adults in Jerusalem would have known how to write and read Hebrew, because it's critical to their religion. And not a single person did. Not a single person wrote a single word about anything to do with anything about Jesus Christ until Paul shows up in the 50s and he starts writing about this angel version, right?
Yeah, and we're talking about, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but we're talking about a culture of individuals, ancient Jews, whose entire culture was based off of writing down their religion and sharing stories and having just books upon books of this to share and tell the importance of all these things.
Oh yeah, exactly. If the New Testament says like the first 5,000 people who converted to Christianity were Jews, that's hard to believe that no one wrote anything down. That's just insane to me. That would be like the utmost important thing for them to do.
Hmm. Is that the story of when Paul goes and says that is it Paul that said there was all these witnesses to,
His conversion.
yeah.
He
No, no,
said,
not to his conversion. He says that there's all these like witnesses to the or to the crucifixion and the resurrection.
yeah,
But
yeah.
he mentions a city that's fuck tons away that nobody's gonna travel to 40 years later and go start questioning people about what they saw. Like it's like, take my word for it.
Yeah.
God told me there was all these people that saw it.
Well, again, his version of the resurrected Jesus was one that just reveals himself to you. It's like Paul
Mm,
believed that he had seen the resurrection, he had witnessed the
mm,
resurrection of Christ, even though he hadn't. He talks like he has because he thinks it's all a vision, you know. So he believed himself also to be a witness. So when he refers to other people being witnesses, it's the same way. I know there's only one argument against Paul where he about him knowing Jesus was a man, and that's one of the ones I think that I thought was actually worth mentioning is that he calls James the brother of Jesus. He goes, James, the brother of Jesus, whatever. He mentions that. But Paul uses the word the brothers of Jesus and the brothers to talk about every single person who's Christian already. He's constantly doing that. So he's not actually talking about Jesus Christ, brother James, who's on earth. But, so that's one of the points people get stuck on. They're like, oh, he mentions James and the brother. And it's like, well, he calls everyone brothers of Jesus. Yeah. So, but other than that, like, it's pretty amazing once you realize that it wasn't even until another 20 or 30 years after Paul finished writing his letters. And yeah, you're right. The general idea is that he wrote up to 13 of the 27 New Testament books, but for sure, I think all scholars agree for sure he wrote 7 at least.
yeah.
And those are all the ones that end with Ians, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I talked about that before. How those other ones are forgeries or aren't necessarily written by Paul.
It's hard to know. It's hard.
We don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff added, and it's the same with Peter. I mean, like Peter didn't write first and second Peter. We know for a fact that Peter didn't write second Peter. And second Peter actually is the only place in the New Testament where one of the disciples backs up Paul, where he says Peter calls him a brother of the Lord or something like that.
If you ever want to do a fun study, this is just a side note. Second Peter and Jude are actually retaliation letters against the Book of Enoch, and almost like 70% of those are actually quotes out of the Book of Enoch of them arguing against it. And Christians oftentimes utilize it to try to like argue hell and fallen angels and stuff like that. But if you read it closely, and of course at this time we didn't have like quotation marks and stuff to put around the text, but if you read it, they're essentially saying if you believe this bullshit that you read in this book, you got to at least know this much. And it's so fascinating to take those side by side and read them and see how it was really just an argument against other literature that was going about at the time.
Yeah.
Somehow we took like these single page letters and put it into the Bible and said, oh, this is.
Oh, yeah, this makes sense for us. Yeah. Well, you're right. Like Jude like quotes an entire paragraph from an Enoch word for word, like just straight up, just boom, boom, boom. Yeah.
Yep.
And Peter, like you said, Peter mentions it too. You know, what's funny too is you mentioned like side by sides. If you take the book of James and the book of Galatians and side by side them, it looks like they're arguing with each other. And I believe that they may have been. So James would have been one of the other 12, you know, if well, we don't even know for sure he wrote it, but they attribute it to him. But they totally contradict each other back and forth. You know, one's like, James is like, faith without works is dead. And Paul's like, our works are like filthy rags. You know, it's going back and forth. It's crazy. So you can see that they, you know, that was originally my first reason for dropping Paul was like, it looks like the other disciples don't agree with him. But yeah, man. So going back to, you know, Dionysus, you have pretty much everyone in the Greco-Roman world would have been familiar with Orphic rituals or rituals that relating to the writings of Orpheus, and Orpheus wrote about Dionysus. And so when you really look at the stuff going on, by the way, I wanted to mention this, and I almost got off track, but in another really interesting about the Bacchae by Euripides again 405 BC, he has stories that really parallel a lot of stories in Acts. Actually, there's a story of people who are in a prison, and there's an earthquake, and it shakes the chains off of their hands, and then they get free. And then Pentheus, you know, freaks out, runs in with a sword to see what's going on, and they stay behind, and they're like, "We've stayed," you know. And then Dionysus shows up, and it's just like, oh my gosh, this is like the story of Paul and Silas and all that, sort of being told way before Paul and Silas. So when you really, it's really funny because we take this stuff so seriously, in life or death, and we've seen how it is life or death. People will kill each other over this stuff. But I can't express enough how if we were raised, in 350 BC in Greece or Athens, and we went to the schools everyone else went, or just were on the up and up with philosophy and stuff, we would think that Jesus is such a joke, because we would already see like, oh, well, okay, this part of Jesus came from this part of Jesus came from that, and all these pieces come together, and you're like, oh, well, if Jesus can't be real, obviously, because none of these other people were real that he copied, so.
Yeah. Now, before listeners, I don't want you guys to misinterpret what Justin is saying, because I don't think he's advocating this. Don't go off and start worshiping Dionysus, because those stories as well have older traditions and thematics that are shared. I mean,
that's right.
Inanna and Sumerian myth, some of those same aspects are shown.
That's right.
In this, I was sharing with you some stuff that's found in Slavic mythology that's also replicated and things that we see here too. And so you can keep taking these stories back into other mythologies. It's just that the further back we go, the less evidence we have, or the less skills we had as a species to copy down things, to write things down. And this is another reason why I think that was Paul's as successful as he was. He had the ability to travel. He had the ability to have scribes copy letters and copy manuscripts. They were able to bring people into gatherings where there was civilization built and worship centers that were built where people could come in and read these to large crowds and spread it. Those didn't exist at prior times to that level with the same means that he had. And this is why Christianity took off, why he was such a great PR person, because it couldn't have happened prior to that point.
That's a great point, man. That's a great point. Plus, he had the freedom to do that, like there was official state religions in some places and times. So, and the fact that he was able to freely run around and do this, just without being killed, is that alone is gave, like you said. But yeah, I agree with you, man. It's he had the most writing power, and his letters were just copied, and yeah.
we could keep going. I actually wanted to talk to you about the Messiah complex as well, the big project that you worked on.
Yeah,
I know we've been talking for a while, but if there's anything else to add in there, you working on the Messiah complex, which was this project that you undertook to, again, trying to help people understand about Jesus and why he was the Messiah, and kind of helping support your belief. This actually proved to you that he was not the Messiah.
That's correct.
For some of those that have done a deep dive study into early Judaism, we know that Jesus wasn't the first or the last Messiah that was crucified or killed in some way that did not fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament. There was many in the years prior to him, as well as some, I want to say even up to 200, 300 CE, where we saw those that tried to essentially be that Messiah and failed in doing so. But if you could, what was some of the things I think that told you that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, why the Jews rejected him, and why he wasn't that individual?
Great question. Yeah. So, I spent a lot of time in the Messiah complex proving that you could find Jesus in the Old Testament. But the problem is I wasn't considering the chronological historicity of this stuff. I would just assume that this is the word of God, so nothing else really mattered. So if I could find Jesus, if I could find all these characteristics of Jesus in Joshua, and I could find all these characteristics of Jesus in Moses, and in fact, I had a side-by-side comparison. I think it was 20, Moses did this, Jesus did this, Moses did this, and I was like, look, I'm going to just destroy these people and show them that Jesus is all over the Old Testament. And I had this epiphany near the end of my article series that, Jesus's authors could have been copying these ideas about Moses, because Moses said there'll be a prophet like me that will come one day, blah, blah, blah. So you could easily say, okay, let's build this Jesus character to look like Moses, and to look like the conqueror, Joshua. So once I started seeing that, I'm like, okay, so I gotta be fair then with the text and the historicity of this. So I went, let's go see. I thought these prophecies really were boomers. I was like, prophecy here, boom, prophecy here, boom. So let's go find out, what the alternative explanation is for this, because, you can't tell yourself that you studied something and came to a decision unless you've heard the best arguments on both sides, And so I was fortunate enough to find Tovia Singer. Have you watched any of his stuff?
Yeah, I know Tovia.
I love that guy, man. And literally, when I started watching Tovia Singer, I had friends that were like, "Oh, don't watch Tovia Singer. That's like a death sentence to your faith, man." And I'm like, "Well, then I have to see it. What are you talking about? I mean, not because I want to lose my faith, but because what are you talking about? Like, that's not honest, right?" So, anyway, once I started realizing through the help of Tovia and other Jewish rabbis online that Jesus didn't fulfill anything from the Old Testament whatsoever, and anytime where he appears to have done so, it's literally just a Christian insertion of a story that makes it sound like he might have had something to do with, an old prophecy. But the reality is, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's a supposition or it's identity politics at that point.
It's
all what it is.
And so if you actually go to the rabbis and talk to them about it or listen to their explanation of things, you'll see that Christians think about prophecies way differently than Jews do. And so Christians have, for one, they have this sort of types and shadows mentality, right? So everything that occurred in the past will happen again. And the past, there was like this physical, weak, like this tangible, physical, like lesser truth was being revealed, but it's only to cast this like much greater experience that's coming. It's just to tell a story about something bigger, like in a spiritual realm that's going to develop long term, and that's how you end up with these people reading the book of Daniel and thinking that, it's the end times, but the reality is, these prophecies were fulfilled in their time. And, especially the prophecies, most of the ones that people point to about Jesus, people will say, oh, look, right there, it says, a bruised reed he will not break, and he won't raise his voice in the streets, and all this stuff. And you're like, and I can't remember the rest of that chapter, but you're like, oh, this certainly is talking about Jesus. It sounds just like Jesus. But then, you talk to a rabbi and they're like, no, it sounds like the next chapter. Where it sounds like well, I can't remember exactly which one it is, which chapter, but it mentions Emmanuel specifically. It says, "Oh, Emmanuel," and the context of where that's written, and I think it's in Isaiah, it makes it sound like he's talking about Jesus once again. But then you find out that this prophet is speaking about an actual baby boy named Emmanuel that was born in like a few chapters later. And we look at that today and we go, oh, like this is about Jesus, and it's like, no. And this is where we go back to the way Jews look at things. They look at prophecies are a tool for God or Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever you want to call him. They're Hashem. They're a tool for him to show his people in the present when the thing is happening that they can trust this prophet and that he's going to like, look, this is your last chance to obey me, otherwise I'm going to spank you, or, and those are what prophecies usually are. And, when God performs a miracle for prophets, it's so that they can prove themselves to his people and so that they can turn around and have an action that occurs immediately. And so, when the Jews didn't obey, they were carried off to Babylon, and that was prophesied that would happen. Of course, we know the prophecy was written after they went to Babylon.
Right.
But that's how prophecies are supposed to work, according to that's literally the whole purpose and point of a prophet, is to come and speak to a current modern generation and fix things, right? So this idea that these prophecies that were already fulfilled are going to sort of happen again, like there's a prophecy cycle or like a double fulfillment of prophecy, is completely foreign to the Jewish people, to the original Hebrew context, So that's really a Christian invention designed to make us sort of look at the Old Testament through that lens. Like, oh, the whole thing was just building up to this moment of Jesus. And it's like, no, it wasn't. And so the prophecy part of it, when that started falling apart, I just decided, well, let's just look at it from a legal perspective, because I was Torah observant and I studied the Torah very much. Now, the Jews have a lot more of the Torah than we do. They have the Mishnah Torah, and they have all these additional texts, and and it's really funny. Not funny. It's good. It's beautiful. The Jewish people have a ton of commentaries from a lot of rabbis over the years, and they're very like loosey goosey about who believes what. It's cool. Like you think Rabbi what's his name said, oh, this is what's going to happen with the Messiah. And Rabbi what's his name says something different, and they're all just like, that's cool. Whereas Christians were like denominationally like at each other's throats, you know. But when I started really studying the Torah and following it myself, I noticed that Jesus wasn't following the Torah all the time, and that it's, you know,
he speaks directly against
he speaks directly against it. Yeah, yeah, and that was really the straw that broke the camel's back. When I was like, wait a second. I went back through Matthew 5, chapter 5. This is where the Beatitudes are. But then after he does the Beatitudes, he does the stuff about oaths and about adultery and about retaliation. And I think there's 3 or 4 major subheadings of things he talks about in that context. And I started noticing that he's literally quoting the Torah and saying, don't do that. Mm-hmm. Specifically when he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He's quoting Leviticus. That's what it says in Leviticus, the Torah. He goes, but I say, you know, if someone slaps you on the cheek, then turn to him the other one also. And if someone asks you for your cloak, then give him your tunic also. And if they ask you to walk a mile, then walk 2 miles, and all this stuff.
And this is blasphemy to the Jewish people.
Absolutely. They're like, what? Like so the Torah, this is what Christians don't understand. They think the Torah was a moral thing only. But it wasn't. It was an actual legal government. Mm-hmm. That's all they had. So there weren't laws about roads and stuff. There were laws about farming, priests, mm-hmm. kings, women, men, individual justice systems, you know, and if someone, you know, I mean, literally there's laws in there. If your cow gets loose, you're supposed to help your neighbor get his cow back. And if, you know, if your cow kicks his cow and kills it, then you have to kill your cow and split the meat with your neighbor. Like there's like, mm-hmm. they're addressing problems that they were dealing with governmentally, like actually. Like they didn't have cops. They had elders, and they had the Torah, and they enacted their own law, you know. So that understanding of the Torah is something that's foreign to Christians when they think, oh, well, Jesus's moral teachings replaced the moral teachings of the Torah. And it's like, no, the Torah was a government. Right? So Jesus is coming in and speaking against the government of the Jews. He's saying, you know, I know the Torah gives you a way to make sure you don't get ripped off, you know, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, stuff like that. But I'm saying let people take advantage of you. I'm saying don't retaliate when people hurt you. I'm saying be a doormat. That's what I'm saying, you know. It literally makes no sense, you know. Or the Torah, he goes on in Matthew 5 and says that it's you know, it's unlawful for anyone to divorce their wife except for, you know, that she cheats on him or vice versa. That they cheat on each other. Sexual immorality. That's the only reason why you could divorce someone. But then he goes on to say, though, that if you marry a divorced woman, though, you also commit adultery. And so we literally have, to this day, I've met them, and I actually seriously considered their arguments at one point, what's called remarriage adultery. And this is the actual belief that exists today, that if you've married of someone who was divorced, a female who was, I shouldn't say female, but a woman who was divorced, then you actually committed adultery, and they're actually encouraging you to go get a divorce again and not do that again. Like, so this is a real thing. So it's because of the words of Jesus here. And the Torah isn't even that harsh. The Torah says if the man finds something unclean in her, then he can write her a certificate of divorce, and then of course she can go and remarry. You know, now there's a lot of reasons why the Torah is not. It is harsh, for, you know, but in that specific instance, we have Jesus again saying, we're going to do something different with that. You know, so there's several times where he does that just in Matthew 5, and when I realized that, I was like, oh my gosh, he's literally speaking against the Torah. And according to Deuteronomy chapter 13 and chapter 18, if you speak against the Torah, then you're a false prophet. So there's no reason why a Jew, either ancient or modern, should ever accept the teachings of Jesus. It doesn't make any sense.
Which I don't know that we have the evidence to definitively say that Jesus was a real person or even existed.
Agreed.
But I've kind of held to the theory that there is probably an individual like Jesus that did these things and was put to death, and then Paul again married these ideas, utilized that, and built a religion around it. That Jesus, in my mind, was no more of a Messiah than the other Messiahs. Simon of Perea, the Egyptian Messiah that disappeared. There's a number of them that were rejected. The individuals that came up that were supposed to free the Jewish people from Rome. They were going to allow them to essentially find themselves and be proven to be the chosen people, that time and time did not make the cut. And Jesus was just another one. He just happened to have, like, I keep saying it, a better PR person. He had a better PR guy.
No, you're right. You're right. No, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. Have you seen what's it called? Caesar's Messiah?
I have. Dan McClellan and I talked about that. He is
cool.
not in agreement of it. He says that he says that it's kind of a fringe theory and doesn't have the evidence there. But I think it's fun to entertain and talk about. Yeah,
totally. I'm not 100% in agreement with it either. But one of the things that you do pick up from that is the historical context. And the historical context is correct. And the historical context is that the Jews were expecting a physical, tangible Messiah-type leader to come from within their ranks and literally lead them in literal combat to kick Rome out of Jerusalem and take Jerusalem back and take the temple back. Again, this goes back to the Maccabean revolt of like 400. Yeah. So, when the Maccabeans, basically, it's just a long story, but in order to get Greece kicked out, I think it was Greece at the time, they had to invite the Romans in and accept the Romans' like protection to get Greece out. This is like 400 years prior. So now you have Romans running things in Jerusalem. That's why on the scene of the first century, you have Rome all over Jerusalem, and their guards are walking around because they've invited them in for protection, but now they're also subject to some of the Roman authority. So the Jews, the traditionalist Jews, there was two types of Jews at the time. Well, probably more than that, but two main groups, right? The traditionalists, who wanted to do things the old way. They wanted to keep the Torah exactly how it is. And then there were the progressives, which we call Hellenized Jews, like Paul. Those are progressives. So the traditionalists didn't like the progression that was occurring with the Hellenization of Jerusalem. So they wanted to say, so they saw this happening. They saw what Paul and people like him were doing. And they're like, no, you guys are trying to invite Roman and Greco-Roman thinking into our shit, and we don't want that. We're gonna Torah only and stuff, and we want God, Yahweh, to come and kick Rome out. So there were literal men who said, I am he, and this is going to be me. I'm going to do this. One of the most famous ones is a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba, and he was one of the ones that happened right around the same time as Jesus.
I remember that name. Yep.
Yeah, he literally tried to lead a rebellion and kick Rome out of Jerusalem with actual Israelite soldiers.
He didn't win.
No, he died. Right. So, this is the context within which Paul introduces us to a different type of Messiah, and I think this is something that still should be considered for everyone because it makes a lot of sense. And this version of Messiah never ever speaks against Rome. In fact, he speaks in support of Rome constantly. He says to pay taxes to Rome. He says to support or be submissive to every governing authority, right? And this is completely in contradicting and in contrast of what traditional Jews want. They
the what you're going into. Hopefully, I'm not going to where you're going and
no, get there, do it.
But it is that. What the argument is from some Christians, and I've even seen this before, even those that study the theory, is that Jesus came to end traditional Jews with the falling of the temple of 70, and that was it. And so the religion that Paul had created was doing just that. It was pushing the Hellenized Jews' agenda to end the traditional Jews to allow Rome to continue to be in power and in the temple and in what power that they did have.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And it serves as a really good explanation too for the progressive Jewish, Hellenized Jews, the first Christians. It's a great explanation as to why Jerusalem failed. Like if Yahweh was supposed to be like all powerful and with them, why is he not keeping his promises again? Why are they failing again? And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to write prophecies about the temple falling again, and we're going to insert a different type of Messiah. Like, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, you can see that temptation to introduce a Messiah who is pro-Rome and anti-traditional, and that's why every time a Jew, traditional Jew, walks up to Jesus, according to the New Testament, Jesus calls him a name, calls him some name. You know, he's
Yes.
like, "You whitewashed tombs, you hypocrites, you know,
And
snakes."
I want to put this pin in it too, just for food for thought. Is that by the time that they were writing the New Testament and putting these in there, which we don't know that when all of them were written, we know we have copies of copies of copies, but by the time these were put in there, we now have 400, 500 years of a constant cycle that can be observed in history, that you can write prophecy that fits what you're continuously seeing, what Jews are talking about, why messiahs are rising up, to essentially provide that to continue on throughout history and keep people within the systemic place of being controlled by
Yep,
others.
absolutely.
And we, to this day, 2,000 years later, have people arguing about the same prophecies, the same cycles, the same things happening that were evident back
Mm-hmm.
then. And they already had 500 years worth of history to kind of take and capture and say, hey, let's just have these continuously be on repeat, and we can control people with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
Mm-hmm.
ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever studied anything about social science or political theory, or any of those things, the two ways you control civilization is politics and religion.
Amen. Amen to that, dude. I completely agree, man.
All right, I know we went way over. We're running out of time. And Justin and I already have a whole nother list of things that we could talk about next time, from the Essenes to the Pharisees, to all these ideas and how they
Yeah.
came about. So that would be fun to dive into. But let's go ahead and call it quits for this round. Let folks know where they can connect with you, where they can follow you, where they can hear more about your story and get your videos on all these topics.
Great. Yeah. So the best way to find me, my preference in order of priority would be first to go to YouTube and go to Bullet Holes in the Bible and subscribe to me there. I have a bunch of in-depth sort of studies and teachings that I think people will enjoy watching about Jesus and his Dionysian roots, about Paul, and showing specific phrases and places where he stole Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Seneca. And then another video where I prove that Mark actually used Homer's writings as a framework to build the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark. And there's so much proof of that. It is mind-blowing. So I have to ask you to go to YouTube first. And also, as we mentioned earlier, I'm also at Bullet Holes in the Bible on TikTok. And of course, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram as just Justin Best. So I have also a website, bulletholesinthebible.com.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Justin. It's been wonderful having you here, and thanks to all of you for coming in and listening again. This, of course, has been Josh Raw here on Gaza Tomorrow. I hope you guys all go out there and be the best versions of yourself. Live your life, live your best life, and as always, do what the fuck you will. And that's a wrap.